Hello, I'm Sally Pointer. Interest in prehistoric textiles is at an all-time high at the moment, and it's becoming more apparent as more research is published that although many surviving textile examples are in cultivated flax, people certainly hadn't stopped using wild resources as well. How early yarns and fabrics might have been produced is something that's fascinated me for years, and I'm often found demonstrating possible prehistoric textile techniques at heritage sites right across Britain, where I use many materials, including flax and nettle. Today, though, I want to explore some of the recent research into textile techniques using one of my very favourite plants, the stinging nettle. So I'm out in the glorious Herefordshire countryside collecting nettles, and this video will look at processing them in ways that hopefully would have been familiar in the Neolithic or early Bronze Age. For many decades, it was assumed that draft spinning was an essential part of early textile production, usually also assuming that plant fibres like flax would be retted and beaten and combed much as they are today before spinning. Now, in this shot, I'm working with wool, but the basic principle's the same. Prepared fibres getting drawn out and twisted with a spindle to make a thread. But it's been obvious to textile archaeologists for a long time that textiles, including some early woven ones, date back far beyond the point where spindle whorls are common finds. So, what is going on? To a point, this is explained by the idea that cordage comes first by a great many thousand years. Here I'm making cordage out of nettle fibres that have been peeled but not scraped in any way, so all of the green bark is still on them. And the end result is a two-ply structure, which is not unlike a spun and then plied yarn. At some point, those spindles do start to play a part and textile production becomes more widespread. Now, this is all very well, but as an archaeologist, we want to research to help prove, disprove, or to expand on what we think we know. In 2018, Margareta Glebe and Susanna Harris published a remarkable paper. I'm going to put a link to it in the description of this video. I do recommend it. And I want to thank them for making it both open access and under a Creative Commons license, which means that people like me can use it when teaching. In this paper, they re-examine many of the most important Neolithic and early Bronze Age European bast fibre textiles and demonstrate conclusively that they're produced by splicing and not by spinning. Now, this isn't always easy to understand without seeing it in action, so this video will look at how we can turn stinging nettles into yarn suitable for weaving using splicing methods and tools broadly consistent with this time period, and it owes a huge amount to the paper I've just mentioned. Now, we don't know exactly how our prehistoric ancestors were processing their nettles, but I'm going to try and do my little experiment today using materials that are at least consistent with the technology they've got available. So I've picked my nettles, didn't bother with gloves, don't usually need to as long as you're careful. I'm going to split them open and I'm just going to use a little bit of wood to do this. So it helps if I turn this around for me. So you don't have to break all the way along, but it is a bit faster in this instance. And that should let me split the nettle all the way down its centre part. Now, the important parts of the nettle here are the bark on the outside, this green bit. Now, the fibres lay within that, but on the inside there's this pithy, woody part. We need to break that away. So usually that's just a case of bending back, snapping it off. Sometimes it comes off more easily than others. Today I think this one's going to be awkward. It's because it knows I'm filming it. Usually once you get them started though, it peels away quite nicely. It's worth re-snapping periodically so you don't leave the best bits behind. Now, in modern day use, I'll quite often use a blunt table knife to do the next part, but again we want to keep it within the realms of what might be correct for the period in question. So I've got some flint tools here. These are just flint flakes, which a flint knapper friend of ours has very kindly provided me with. I'm going to try this one. It's got a slightly flattish, slightly serrated edge to it. And what I need to do is scrape away as much of the green part as I can to leave the white fibres behind. I'm going to try it on a board first, but the flint might not be flat enough for that. That's working quite well. Every flint's different, so sometimes you have to try different ones to get one that's comfortable in your hand. Oh, I think I like this one even better. I'll just do a little bit of this to show you. I do have other videos on preparing nettle fibres if you're not quite getting enough visuals here. But can you see the fibres are starting to show through? I just need to keep scraping till we've got as much of the green off as possible, leaving as much of the fibre behind. That's coming up really, really nicely. You should be able to see that that's separating into its constituent parts really very, very well. Flints are amazingly good tools. There are some styles of flint that they believe have been knapped and shaped especially for fibre processing. These are just flakes that happen to be a comfortable shape, and they're working really very well for me. Now, there's a fine line with this processing. If I scrape too hard, you see a lot of my fibres have come away with it. But that's okay, I'll just sort those out, put them back into my bundle. Always a compromise. We want to get fibre that's fairly clean, but with enough of the green left. Now the green's got pectin and other gums in it, and that's going to help hold these strands together for the splicing part. Just have to be a bit careful around the knots where the leaf joints. Quite often the fibres will want to break at that point, but we just want to keep the strands as long as we can without getting lumps and bumps. There. Now that, I think, will do for my purposes. So from that nettle we've ended up with a slightly green ribbon that will split down into lots and lots of thin strands. Now, I want to split it up into as many thin bits as I can at this stage, because that helps make sure that I haven't got lumpy bits at the leaf joints. But what I'll do now is I'll process a few more, I'll take these home and I'll hang them to dry before we do the next stage. And after about 10 minutes work, 5 nettles have turned into this bundle of certainly imperfect but scraped enough fibre. Now we're going to take these home, dry them out, and we should be able to go on to the next part of our prehistoric nettle splicing experiment. And after probably 10 minutes work, this is what we've got. This is the fibre from 5 nettles, and as you can see I've left plenty of the green on there just to hold the strips together, but at the same time those white fibres are clearly showing through. Now I'm going to put those to dry. This is some that was dried yesterday. That's 10 nettles worth. So together I'm going to have the fibre of 15 nettles for this little experiment. We'll give that a few hours, possibly overnight, to dry, and then we'll go on to stage 2. These nettles have dried out properly now. This was the fibre from 15 nettles, which yesterday I peeled and I scraped quite roughly using a flint flake. And as you can see, the fibres are separating out quite nicely, but they're still quite stiff. There's a certain amount of green on them. I can see little knots where the leaf joints were. So I'm going to soften them up a little bit more before I start. I'm just going to rub them between my palms quite vigorously. Now, it's a little hard to see on the video, but there is quite a lot of dust coming off. That's little tiny flakes of bark and woody material just coming away. In fact, you can probably see it on the table there. And it's amazing how much cleaning up you can do just by this sort of friction. And this is something that could have been done much later in the year if necessary. It's very hard to know for certain, but I can quite imagine our earlier ancestors harvesting the nettles at their peak and then saving the final processing until whatever was burningly important at that time of year was out of the way. There are some bits of the year where there really isn't that much to do, apart from stay in, stay dry, stay warm. And I think textile processing is something that works quite well at that point. Look at the mess, goodness. As well as rubbing between my hands, I can also make use of flints that have got a fine serrated edge. Now these are well known archaeologically. They don't necessarily look exactly like these ones, but extensive experimentation by several researchers has demonstrated that using them to process things like nettles or flax or other plant materials will result in a gloss on the edge of the flints, which is seen on the original ones. So we think it's highly likely that people are processing fibres using flint tools. Now what's happening when I do this is that the very, very rough, fluffy bits and the very, very short fibres are coming away. And again, it's softening things, it's removing any little impurities that I've left behind. It's just refining things. Remember, for this particular experiment, I don't want to get down to utterly clean, stripped fibres. I want some of this bark to remain. So I'm just going to do this just until I'm satisfied that the very, very worst of the knots and lumps have been got out of the way, and this waste material can be used for stuffing things. I could make it into coarse cordage, makes quite good fire lighters. I'll periodically go back to softening and rubbing between my hands. I reckon for this bundle 10 minutes work will be about right to get this ready for my next stage. Just show you a closer look at some of the flints. As I said, these aren't exact replicas of known ones, they're just really flakes that have had the edges touched very, very slightly to give them a slight serration. For me, they're working very, very nicely indeed. So let's get on to the fun bit. So for this experiment, we're very much working with this diagram from the Gleber and Harris article. What I'm going to try and do is extract this and stick it up in the corner of the video if I'm clever enough. What I'm also going to do is rotate it so that it matches the direction that I tend to work in. So just to recap, the purpose of the experiment in this video is to try out both of these splicing methods. This one's continuous splicing, this one's end-to-end splicing, and as with all of these things, there's always more than one way of achieving the same result. So we'll try a couple of different methods, and we'll try throughout to keep the finished thread thin enough to be used for eventual weaving. So we're not aiming for chunky cordage like I normally demonstrate. We want thin thread that can be used in weaving projects. So first up is continuous splicing, and this is essentially cordage. Now this little bit of nettle fibre I've very, very briefly dampened. I think just moistening it in the mouth would have worked just as well. And we want to be working for this with really just one of the strips at a time, more or less, or perhaps 1 and a bit strips, because I want to be adding some in. We're trying to keep it nice and thin. So generally the principle with this is, just as I've demonstrated with cordage many times in other videos, you twist and you cross, you twist and you cross, you twist and you cross, you twist and you cross. If you were left-handed, it would be twist down, cross up, twist down, cross up, twist down, cross up. So it's exactly the same end result regardless of which hand you work in. Now the diagram shows that when you need new parts, you're adding them in along the sides. And there are 2 schools of thought with this. The diagram shows, and it's a little early to add it, but I'm going to do it anyway. Let's find a nice thin end. It shows the adding on the side, and it overlaps, and I'm going to need one for the other side. Let's have another little thin bit. There's a little thin bit. And you would just add bits on the side as you need them. Now this certainly works, but it does have an issue, and can you see the issue is that you get little frilly bits sticking out. Now that may or may not be a problem. Quite often in use those little bits will just break away, but they can also represent a weak spot. Because they're not bound in, it's possible that they'd slip. So the way I often recommend when I'm teaching cordage making is, I just put that down for a second and separate off another very thin bit. Now I'm conscious, because I'm trying to demonstrate this all in one go, that I'm actually adding fibres rather more often than I usually would. So normally I wouldn't bother adding a new fibre until I'm really quite a long way into the trailing ends. So I am getting a little bit thicker as I go. However, we'll just get the technique bits out of the way. So first way with continuous splicing is to just add lying along the side. But personally, I tend to teach people to take a tiny wisp of fibre and to lay it more or less from the midpoint right across both bundles. Get that out of the way. Right across both bundles, so that as soon as you start twisting it in, it's completely secure and there are no bits to fall out. Now, somebody pulled me up on this in one of my cordage videos and said, oh, that's a terrible idea, because if you lay it in at the equal point, you're going to run out on both sides at the same time. And I do take their point. However, I don't think it's as drastic as all that, because although I say roughly at the midpoint, actually it's never exactly even. What you tend to find, and they're now my longest ends, if I go down to the far end, that even with roughly halfway, oh, can you see this at all? This is so thin, this fibre. One bit is still carrying on for a long bit way, and the other one has tailed off rather earlier. So even though I lay in roughly at the midpoint, it's never exactly halfway. The other thing, and this is probably more important, if we try and look at both ends of one of these strips of fibre, you tend to find that one end is a little bit thicker than the other. We'll ignore that bit because it's got bark on it. Right, that's better. Can you actually see that at all? Gosh, it is thin, this stuff. One end is just a little bit fatter than the other because of the way it's been peeled off the bark. So yeah, it is a perfectly valid comment that that particular person made, that you don't want all your ends to finish at the same stage, but I think it's not really an issue. Now, the important bit about continuous splicing is that your finished thread is finished. You've got two strands that have been twisted and bound together, and the end result is a cord. It looks very, very much like a modern piece of yarn when it's done. And I can certainly make that thin enough to weave with, but you're always going to see that strongly plied structure all the way throughout the finished piece. You're not really going to see where you've added in new bits or not, because they happen so continuously. This pretty much represents the earliest forms, we think. We think cordage comes a long time before weaving originates, and whilst there's a huge overlap, this sort of cord making probably does belong to a slightly earlier tradition. So that's the first version, and two ways of doing it. So either lay in little by little, bit on one side, bit on the other, or lay it around, watching out for too many ends overlapping. Definitely works. You can make this infinitely long, so make a bit, wind it up onto a stick, finger in this case, make a little ball of it, and the end result is something that makes very, very beautiful, very stable, very, very strong thread. Perfect for sewing thread, perfect for robust things. Okay, the other one though is the end-to-end splicing, and that's what is starting to show up a lot more in the actual archaeological textiles. Now, in exactly the same way that with continuous splicing there were a couple of different ways to get the same result, with end-to-end splicing you have exactly the same thing. And this is the slightly trickier technique, and this is the one that a lot of people have trouble visualizing until they see it. Now, you can see just how fine this little strip of nettle is, but you can also see, particularly on this bit, that there's plenty of green holding it together. Now, end-to-end splicing is going to join just these ends. So we're going to end up with a little bit of twist here, but most of it isn't going to be twisted at all. And this actually is where licking the ends really comes into their own. Good thing I'm doing this off screen. So with end-to-end splicing, you overlap sufficient, and generally it's enough to get the two thin bits overlapping, and you just give them a really, really, really good twist. So I've got a bit here with a twist, but most of the body hasn't. Now, there is an immediate downside. If I give this a pull, well, actually, that's not bad at all, but it could slip. So it is going to rely on being plied together with a second piece in a moment. I'll do one more on the end of this bit, just to make sure. I am aware that it's really actually quite hard to see the ends of these. So I've got two little frilly ends. I'm just going to give them a quick lick. Saliva does actually have enzymes in it that can help activate the plant gums. Overlap the ends, give it a really good twist. Now you can probably see you'd quite quickly get into a tangle doing this. So the trick is, if I go back to my original starting point, to wind it up as you go. Make yourself a little ball of the stuff. Which of course it's going to start very tiddly, but it will get bigger. So there's my very first splice about to go in, and actually I'm pretty pleased with how that's holding. It wouldn't take huge amounts of stress, but it's certainly holding together for light tugging. So I'll just wind that up until I get near the end, then I'd splice in another bit and keep going. That's absolutely fine. So the second way of doing this is very similar, but it has a slight refinement. Now, again, one thin frilly end, another thin frilly end. I'm just going to give them a quick lick. Now, with this variation on end-to-end splicing, rather than overlapping them one against the other and twisting, I'm going to put them side by side. See that better over my hand, isn't it? Give that section a twist, quite a strong twist, and then fold it back and twist it into the body of the material. Now this one is even stronger. Now, both of these methods have been identified on early textiles. The really important thing about end-to-end splicing is that the main part, is that even nearly in focus? We'll try, has almost no twist in it at all. It might pick up just the tiniest bit from the splice, just expanding down a bit. So there's no twist at all in this section. When you get to the bit with the splice in it, there's actually quite a lot of twist at that stage. Now, this is, as I said, stronger than it looks, but you wouldn't put the tension of a loom under this. So what you have to do with spliced material, I'm just unwinding some of my little bundle I've just made, is you need to take 2 strands of it. Now look, you can already see how those spliced ends are starting to go a bit frilly and start to slip there just a little bit. And you need to put 2 strands next to each other so the splices do not sit next to each other, and then you put a twist into the whole thing. That's where the spindle starts coming in use, although it's perfectly possible for me to do that by hand, wind it onto my stick or into a little ball, twist a bit more, so a tool isn't necessary, but it would help. What you're going to get here is something that for the bulk of it, you can see it's got a twist, but it doesn't look plied, and it's only when you get to the bit where the splice appears. That probably is really hard to see on the screen. I'll try and put some close-ups in if I can work out how to do the technical stuff. It's only where the splice appears that it will actually look plied. This is what is turning up over and over and over again in the archaeological material. And this now should be strong enough to weave with. So my job now is to make some more of this. I'm going to concentrate on this method. We know the cordage works. We know that the version that looks like very, very thin cord is stable. It's been around for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. No issues there at all. This is the one I'm going to make quite a lot more of. In fact, I'm going to make 2 balls of it. And then I'm going to use my spindle just to speed up the plying. And hopefully the end result will be enough thread for me to set up a very small project on a loom, and we'll see how the end result looks. And with obligatory background cat noises, just to prove it's one of my videos, here's my attempt at a close-up of the finished samples. So this is the continuous splicing, essentially cordage, a technique that virtually everybody watching this will be quite familiar with. This is the end-to-end splicing. Now, it's a little harder to point out what's going on, but you can see here a splice where it looks plied, and in the rest of the body of a section where a splice isn't next to it, it just looks twiddled together. There's another splice here. The section of fibre next to it really doesn't look as if there's much twist in it at all. So I had originally planned to show you some of the... I had originally planned not to have a cat sitting in front of my work. Hello, Tesla. Oh dear. The plan had been to show plying of the spliced fibres at the very end of this, but given that the cat has decided that it's time for me to stop, and he's probably right, I'll save that for the next video. There will be another one, won't be immediately straight away. I've got a little bit of things to do first, but I'm going to finish up this and rather more nettle, and I will ply it together, and then we'll have another video where we look at the effects of plying on a spliced fibre and what happens when we weave it, and then what happens when we wash it, beetle it, generally abuse it, all the things we can do to it to get rid of the remaining bark and give us a really soft, workable textile. Bye for now.